Pull up a satellite image of Europe at night, and you will see an unbroken chain of light. London blazes along the Thames, Amsterdam burns white against the flatlands. Antwerp, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, every major coastline on the continent glows with the density of a civilization that has never stopped building. And then your eye reaches the northwest coast of Germany. A 300-mile corridor of North Sea shoreline sits in near darkness. Not undeveloped, Germany is one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, not forgotten. This stretch appears on every strategic map since the Roman era, just empty in a way that has no obvious explanation, and that almost no one ever stops to question. That is what this investigation is about. Subscribe now or lose the thread. The algorithm buries this kind of content. Pin it down. The conventional explanation, when people offer one at all, usually involves politics, the Hanseatic League, German federalism, the peculiarities of Northern European trade patterns. Politics is not what made this coast dark. The answer is written into the earth itself. By the end of this investigation, you will understand why Hamburg, Germany's largest port and the second busiest in all of Europe, sits 60 miles from the open ocean, connected to the North Sea only through a river estuary. You will understand why the Dutch built one of history's most ambitious engineering projects on a nearly identical coastline, while the Germans moved inland and never came back. And you will understand what happened on the night of January 15th, 1362, a date recorded in every medieval chronicle from Bremen to Lübeck and in almost no school curriculum. We move through 6 layers of this story. The first piece of evidence arrives before you have had time to doubt it. The Wadden Sea, a tidal flat the size of the state of Connecticut, shifts its own floor by up to 3 feet with every tide cycle, and no permanent structure built directly on its surface has survived more than 2 or 3 human generations without disappearing into the sediment. That statement requires a moment. This is not a flood, not an erosion event. The ground itself moves twice a day, every day, by a measurable and documented amount. The Wadden Sea is not a coastline in the conventional sense. It is an intertidal zone, a borderland between the North Sea and the European mainland that is neither land nor sea for roughly half of every 24 hours. At low tide, approximately 4,500 square miles of mudflat and sandbank emerge from the water. At high tide, most of that surface disappears again. What looks like shoreline on a map is, in practice, a twice-daily illusion. The ground here is not solid. It never was. For someone who has walked the granite shores of Maine, or the limestone coastlines of Florida, or the barrier islands of the Carolinas, the Wadden Sea presents a landscape governed by entirely different rules. The sediment here, fine silt, organic mud, and waterlogged peat, does not drain. It does not consolidate under pressure the way soil in a river valley does. It compresses slowly, and then continues to subside for decades. Any weight placed on its surface begins to sink almost immediately. Not dramatically, not all at once, but continuously, like pressing gently into wet clay and never quite reaching the bottom. Consider what that means for anyone who ever tried to build a city here. The Frisians, the indigenous coastal people who occupied this stretch of northwestern Europe from the early medieval period onward, understood this intuitively. Their solution was not to build on the flats themselves, but to construct artificial mounds called terpen, raised earthen platforms on which individual farms and small settlements could sit above the tide line. Terpen were not cities. They were survival platforms. They held a farmhouse, a barn, a family. They did not hold a harbor district, a merchant quarter, or a cathedral. In 2009, UNESCO designated the Wadden Sea a World Heritage Site. The designation is, among other things, an official institutional acknowledgement that the ecosystem is so geologically active it cannot support permanent human infrastructure. You cannot lobby that designation into existence. It describes something that was already true before any committee wrote a word about it. The coast was not empty because no one tried. It was empty because the earth beneath it has a geological memory that outlasts every human plan. But the ground was only the first problem. Above the surface, the shape of the sea itself had been engineering a different kind of catastrophe for centuries. The post-glacial sediment layer that underlies the northwest German coast is, in engineering terms, one of the most demanding substrates on the European continent. After the last ice age, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the glaciers that had covered northern Europe retreated northward, leaving behind a mixture of fine marine clay, compressed peat, and unconsolidated sand. This material was not deposited in thin surface layers. In some sections of the German coast, the post-glacial sediment runs to depths of 60 feet before reaching anything structurally stable enough to support heavy construction. Modern coastal engineering has methods for dealing with this: pile foundations driven to bedrock, reinforced dikes built on compacted fill, drainage systems that actively remove water from the substrate. The Dutch have used every one of these techniques at massive scale, but each technique carries a maintenance cost that is permanent, expensive, and non-negotiable. Remove the maintenance and the land returns to its natural state within a human generation. The Dutch know this. Their entire coastal civilization rests on the assumption that the maintenance will never stop. A 15-foot storm surge arriving at night in winter, across flat land with no natural barriers. That is not a flood. That is an inland sea, delivered in hours. The North Sea amplifies that risk through geometry rather than chance. The sea is wider in the north and narrows progressively as it approaches the coasts of Belgium, the Netherlands, and northwest Germany. A funnel shape that acts as a compression chamber for any major storm system entering from the Atlantic. As the storm pushes water southward, the narrowing coastline has nowhere to send that volume except upward. Oceanographers call this a storm surge, but the physics are better understood as hydraulic compression, a fixed volume of water being forced into a shrinking container. The result is not a wave that breaks on the shore. It is a surface that simply rises steadily across a flat landscape that offers no resistance and no elevation. The records of North Sea storm surges go back to the early medieval period, and they document a recurring pattern of coastal flooding that has struck the same geographic zones: the German Bight, the Frisian Islands, the estuaries of the Elbe and Weser rivers, with a consistency that amounts to geological regularity. Major floods are documented in 1164, 1219, 1287, and 1334. Each one reshaped the coastline. Each one erased settlements that had been built on the tidal flats. So, what happens when a prosperous medieval city is sitting directly in that funnel's path? The answer arrived definitively on the night of January 15th, 1362. Meteorological records reconstructed from ice core data and contemporaneous chronicles indicate a storm of exceptional scale moved across the North Sea from the northwest. Sustained wind speeds equivalent to a modern Category 1 hurricane, driving across a fetch of open water long enough to build a surge of historic proportion. The storm had a name, recorded in the chronicles of monastic communities along the German and Dutch coast. They called it the Grote Mandranke, in Low German, the Great Drowning of Men. The name was not hyperbole. The surge struck during a winter high tide, the worst possible combination of astronomical and meteorological timing. Contemporary estimates, cross-referenced with stratigraphic sediment deposits recovered by 20th century geologists, suggest water levels along the German Bight reached between 15 and 20 feet above normal sea level in the hours after midnight. Entire parishes disappeared. The coastline that had existed on the morning of January 15th did not exist on the morning of January 17th. Hundreds of square miles of inhabited land were permanently claimed by the sea. Among the settlements erased on the night of January 15th, one stands apart, not because it was the largest or the most defensible, but because it left behind enough evidence to be verified, analyzed, and mourned with precision. Rungholt. The city appears in Frisian tax records from the late 13th century as a trading port on the island of Strand, a substantial island in what is now the northern Wadden Sea, near the modern German-Danish border. The records describe a harbor capable of receiving deep-draft seagoing vessels, a church with a tower visible from the water, a merchant community wealthy enough to be assessed for imperial taxes, and a population of several thousand. By the standards of medieval northern Europe, Rungholt was not a footnote. It was a functioning regional economy with documentation to prove it. A city vanished, the tax records remained. When the Grote Mandranke struck on January 15, 1362, Rungholt ceased to exist, not as a ruin, but as a location. The storm surge did not simply flood the city and recede, leaving walls and foundations behind for later excavation. It rearranged the sediment so thoroughly that the land on which Rungholt had stood was permanently submerged. The island of Strand itself was broken into fragments. What had been connected territory became scattered tidal islets. The city's location became, for centuries, a matter of educated speculation. A ghost on old maps, an entry in chronicles, a story that acquired the characteristics of legend precisely because it was too specific to dismiss and too submerged to verify. Stop and translate that into physical reality. A harbor large enough to appear in imperial accounts, gone in one tide cycle. The verification came in stages. In 1921, a researcher named Andreas Busch began systematically examining the tidal flats north of the modern German coast during periods of extreme low tide. What he found, and what subsequent decades of archaeological excavation confirmed, was not legend. Millstones, well linings, peat blocks cut by human hands, ceramic fragments consistent with 14th century Frisian manufacture, all emerging from the mud at positions that match the historical records with a precision that removes all reasonable doubt. Rungholt existed, the storm erased it. The sediment preserved its outline. That confirmation, arriving 8 centuries after the event, reframed the broader question. Because Rungholt was not unique, it was representative. The same storm destroyed dozens of other settlements along the German and Dutch coast that night, and the preceding 2 centuries document dozens more erased by earlier surges. What the Grote Mandranke destroyed in a single night was simply the most documented instance of a pattern that had been repeating for generations. And that pattern produced a decision, not a spoken policy, not a formal edict. An accumulated institutional memory that expressed itself in urban geography. Hamburg, founded as a settlement in the 9th century, was placed on a natural ridge above the Elbe River, 60 miles from the open sea. Bremen was built above the Weser River, at a defensible distance from any direct coastal exposure. Lübeck, the Hanseatic League's dominant northern city, was built on a peninsula between 2 rivers. The cities were not positioned away from the coast by accident. They were positioned away from the coast because the people who planned them had watched what happened to cities that were not. But the most unsettling part is still ahead, because the Germans and the Dutch faced the same landscape and chose opposite responses. Stand in the Dutch city of Rotterdam, and you are standing 12 feet below sea level, not at sea level, below it. The ground beneath your feet was reclaimed from the North Sea by a continuous system of pumps, dikes, and water management infrastructure that requires active maintenance every hour of every day. Remove that infrastructure, and Rotterdam returns to the sea within a human lifetime. The Dutch chose to fight, not because they were braver or more ambitious than the Germans, but because they had no geographic alternative, no high ground, no river ridge, no option. The Netherlands sits at the combined delta of 3 major European rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt. Those rivers deposited the land the Dutch stand on. The land has always been saturated. There was no high ground to retreat to, no river ridge to build a city on, no inland port that could serve as a harbor by proxy. The Dutch either occupied the coast or they ceased to exist as a functioning civilization. Their hydraulic engineering, culminating in the Delta Works, a mid-20th century series of dams and barriers now considered among the 7 wonders of the modern world, is not ambition. It is existential necessity. The Kiel Canal moves more cargo tonnage annually than the Suez Canal. It was the final architectural proof that the German coast itself was never needed. Germany had what the Dutch did not: geographic depth. The Hamburg model placed the city on a protected river estuary, connected to the interior by canal, allowed German commerce to access the North Sea without exposing any major population center to a direct storm surge. The Kiel Canal, completed in 1895, extended that logic to its natural endpoint. It connected the Baltic Sea to the North Sea through a navigable inland waterway, eliminating the last remaining strategic reason to place significant infrastructure on the exposed Wadden coast. The canal did not create Germany's coastal strategy. It confirmed a decision that had already been made centuries earlier, under circumstances far less civilized than an engineering budget. The result is visible in every modern atlas. Germany's northwest coastline has beach resorts, nature preserves, and tidal flats. It has the Frisian Islands, managed as tourist destinations and ecological buffer zones. What it does not have, and has never had at any stable scale, is a major city directly on the open water. That absence is not a gap in history. It is the conclusion of a long argument between a civilization and its geography, in which the geography had the final word. And the irony is that geography's victory was, in the long run, also Germany's. Cities built on rivers survive floods. Cities built on tidal flats eventually join them. What the northwest German coast reveals, when you follow the full sequence from geology to urban planning, is what geographers call path dependency, the principle that the decisions a civilization makes in response to its environment become self-reinforcing over time, until the original decision is no longer visible as a choice, but simply as the way things are. The Wadden Sea is still moving. The tidal flats still shift. The post-glacial sediment that underlies the coast is still compressing, and compressing faster now than at any point in the historical record, because rising sea levels are increasing the rate of tidal inundation and accelerating the subsidence process. Climate projections for the German Bight region anticipate a sea level rise of between 1 and 3 feet by 2100, depending on emission scenarios. That is not a catastrophic number in isolation, but applied to a coastline already at or below sea level in several locations, sitting directly in the North Sea's storm surge funnel, it represents a measurable increase in exactly the conditions that emptied this coast in the first place. What does it mean when an entire civilization organizes itself around the decision not to occupy a piece of its own territory? The Dutch response to that projection is engineering. The delta works are being assessed for upgrades. New barrier designs are being modeled. The maintenance continues, as it always has. The German response, equally characteristic, is the same logic that placed Hamburg on a river ridge in the 9th century. Use the interior, protect the ports that matter, and leave the open coast as a buffer. Both responses are rational. Both are direct products of the geography they were built within. The Dutch inherited a delta with no high ground and produced a hydraulic civilization. The Germans inherited a coast with a navigable interior and produced a river-based civilization. The Wadden Sea sits between them, still shifting, still inhospitable, still recording in its sediment layers the outline of every settlement that ever tried to make it otherwise. Rungholt is not alone in that sediment. It has company. Most of those other cities never made the chronicles. They simply returned to the mud, unnamed, and the sea closed over them as if they had never been built. The irony here is that the most complete record of what this coast did to human ambition is written not in the cities that survived, but in the sediment beneath a sea that most people have never heard of. What the empty coast ultimately tells us is this: the Earth does not negotiate, it offers conditions. Civilizations respond to those conditions, or they pay the price that Rungholt paid, not as punishment, but as physics. The absence along the northwest German shore is not a failure of ambition or a gap in history. It is the accumulated record of a landscape that communicated its limits clearly, at scale, and repeatedly, until the message was finally received and encoded into the location of every major city in the region. The deeper question the empty coast raises is about us, about what we remember and what we don't. We remember Hamburg. We remember Rotterdam. We do not remember Rungholt, or the dozens of settlements whose names appear in a single chronicle entry and then vanish into silence. The cities we study are the ones that survived, the ones that didn't have already told us something far more important. They told us what the Earth actually allows, when we are quiet enough to listen. At low tide, on a clear morning in the North Frisian mudflats, the outline of old walls can sometimes be seen in the sediment. Brief, angular shadows that the water erases again within hours. The coast remembers what the maps were never allowed to show. If today changed how you see one thing, the next video will do it again. Subscribe and stay close.